There we go. As I said, my name is John Ong. I'm delighted to be with you this evening. My backdrop is that of the Grand Lodge Room at Masonic Hall in New York City. This is the rehearsal space of the University Glee Club of New York City. And I should say that this presentation is, in a sense, brought to you by the UGC. The Gun Library is fortunate enough to have um, the Doc Woodruff's papers in its collection. And as they sought to find someone that might have something more to share about the life of Arthur Woodruff, they reached out to the UGC. We certainly prominently mention him a lot in our own public history expressions on the internet. And I had written an article about Arthur Woodruff for our own internal magazine, and therefore thought, well, I'll share what I know. And it gave this lecture date gave the opportunity to dig in a little deeper about Arthur Woodruff's life, especially his life in Washington, Connecticut. He is truly a son of Washington. He was born in 1853 at his family home, which in the records we have from the turn of the century had a name. I wonder if it actually had a name in the 1850s, but as Washington became more of a second home place in the turn of the century, I would guess naming houses became more common. But it was known as Brookside. It was on the green. Well, I'll show you a map in a second. The property later became the second home of Victor McCutcheon of New York City, a friend of Arthur Woodruff's. And but his family, he was well rooted in Washington. Both of his parents grew up in Washington. All four of his grandparents grew up in Washington. All eight of his great grandparents, at least, died and are buried in Washington, and six of his 16 great grandparents lived and are buried in Washington. So again, a multi generational link. I do have a bit of an interest in genealogy, and just those of you that know Washington local history will recognize some of these names. But his great grandparents' surnames are, of course, Woodruff. Smith, his mother's name, his maternal grandmother's names Hine and Fenn, and then his great grandmother's maternal names Baker, Newton, Ford, and Curtis. And I did think that it was kind of funny that your namesake of the Gun Library and Museum being named after Frederick W. Gunn, his parents were John Gunn and Mary Ford, whereas Arthur Woodruff had great great grandparents who were John Ford and Mary Gunn. And while I couldn't have the time to exactly check whether Arthur Woodruff, exactly how Arthur Woodruff and Frederick Gunn might be cousins, I'm pretty sure they are. And of course, any of you that have done a lot of work on families, Great Migration families, and other early British settlers in New England will know that all of us who are descended from those, we're all related, we're all cousins. And so, that wouldn't be very surprising. Arthur was descended from, well, the original American settlers were his four great grandparents, Matthew and Hannah Woodruff. They emigrated from Cambridgeshire to Connecticut in 1653, so they missed the Great Migration of the 1630s, but were part of the kind of second wave that came after the end of the English Civil War. They originally settled in Farmington, and it was Arthur's great grandfather John Woodruff that moved to Washington. The D in his name stands for nothing. It's not part of the early records, and Arthur admitted to adding it himself because he liked it, and certainly was an important part of his identity. Most of the records of the time in his later adult life in dealing with people, he was addressed as AD, and of course, adding middle initials in this era, especially in the generation that he very well represents, of people who moved from the farm, so to speak, small town America, rural America, to cities, adopting middle initials in the late part of the 19th century when city directories become a thing, and just kind of to look normal meant you should have a middle name. Just adding one would be pretty common. And he did it, and as I said, because he liked it. And there is the photograph is from Washington Cemetery. That's his great grandfather, John Woodruff, and his great grandmother. Arthur's parents were Truman Hine and Ellen Smith Woodruff. Uh, in the censuses of 1860 and 1870, his father is mentioned as a merchant in the 60 sentence and clerk in store in 1870. So he was clearly not a farmer, but a business person in the center of town. Uh, Arthur was the older of two sons. He had a brother, Frank, born in 1857. He went to the local school, which would have been across the green from where he grew up, and he attended the gunnery in the 1860s when Frederick Gunn was still the headmaster. He attended that for 5 years. Of course, that also wouldn't have been very far. That would have been just off the south side of Washington Green. He didn't graduate from the gunnery. He was sent, presumably by his father, who was in the store business, but he was sent to the Eastman National Business College in Poughkeepsie in 1869, graduating a year later in 1870. And this was for students of that age. This was a bit of a business finishing school, but it was a big enterprise in its time. But it was dedicated to giving students both of minors like Arthur, but also older people who already had work experience, to give them some very basic training in record keeping, bookkeeping, inventory management. They even ran kind of a sort of a fake railroad and fake stores, but it was very much about practical hands-on experience. And so that was how Arthur was launched into the working world. This is showing you a map this is from the 1867 map of the town of Washington, zooming in on the Washington Green area. And you'll see the three houses along what is now Kirby Road on the west side of Washington Green. The northernmost house is marked T.H. Woodruff, so that's the house where Arthur and his brother Frank grew up. I don't think any of those houses exist now. There's just a single 1890s house, as you know, there. But he was very much in the center of Washington. So, armed with his business graduation diploma, that summer, Arthur came back to Washington and worked as a rodman, sort of helping to survey. Well, rodman is literally a surveying term, but I also think it just means junior person at the bottom of the totem pole for the building of the Chepaug Valley Railroad that was being put through from Danbury to Litchfield and ran along the Chepaug River right through Washington, the town of Washington, ultimately resulting in Washington Depot. So this would have been good labor, pretty close to home, I would think. But his first proper job with his business degree was to work as a stock clerk and then a salesman for Malley and Company, wholesale dry goods merchants in New Haven. We'd call that now, and it became a very well-known department store, Malley's, until the demise of department stores in the post-war era. And sort of many of you will probably remember Malley's. He then went from New Haven to the big city and moved in 1872 and got a job as a sales clerk at Lord & Taylor's, an even bigger department store. But he was there for a short time. Later in 1872, he got employed as a shipping clerk and worked his way up as a superintendent at Bergen and Company, who were milliners. So he got involved in ladies' hats. His last sales job in the world of merchandise was that he moved in 1866 and worked for a year in the tea department of Archer and Bull, who were basically commodities merchants. And essentially tea. They were in this case importing tea, and they imported all kinds of other things. They were basically an importing business. While Arthur was in New York, it was clear that he had musical abilities, and he uh, definitely did musical pursuits alongside his working career. In his later reflections on his early life, he attributed a love for and knowledge of music to both of his parents. They both sang in the choir of the First Congregational Church across the street. And he also mentioned that he took singing lessons as a teenager with Earl Buckingham of Washington. I've looked him up. Earl Buckingham is in the census as a farmer, but apparently he was a musician on the side and gave singing lessons. And also, Arthur recorded that he sang in a double quartet in the summer of 1870, and this would be a men's quartet, so eight voices, TT, TT, BB, BB, participated that in 1870. While in New York City, after he goes for the Lord and Taylor job in 1872, he participates in various singing groups, including some prestigious ones. So he clearly had a very good voice. So he was in the St. Thomas Fifth Avenue choir, Episcopal Church choir. This is in the building, not the current building, which was built in around 1900, but the previous one, but same place. And St. Thomas Fifth Avenue had a top flight Episcopal Church organist and choir, then under the direction of George William Warren, kind of famous 19th century church organist, who wrote many compositions really designed for the St. Thomas Choir. And those of you that are knowledgeable about hymns will recognize probably his most famous hymn is God of Our Fathers. But he also sang in another double quartet called the Hatton Glee Club. And in fact, I got there the writing is a bit small, but there's a program, Hatton Glee Club participating in a benefit concert in Stamford for St. John's Episcopal Church in Stamford. And there you see the Hatton Glee Club with only 7 names, so somebody must have been missing. Somebody couldn't make the trip to Stamford, but Woodruff, Deal, Samford, Phillips, Finch, Talcott, and Hardenberg. That would make the name of a good law firm. But Woodruff got top billing as the first tenor. He also then got 1874. He became the tenor soloist and quartet member, and I'm pretty sure that's a paid engagement at St. James Madison Avenue, another Episcopal church, another one with a larger music budget with a first-class music operation. In 1876, it's clear that all this singing in church singing and also amateur, more pleasurable singing prompted Arthur to give up. I'm going to call him AD now. In all these slides, I call him ADW, but AD. It prompted AD to give up the commercial world and focus on trying to become a full-time musician. He makes this decision 1876, and but of course he really, while he has a beautiful voice and a decent amount of experience in the last few years in New York, he decides he really needs to ramp up his education. So he sort of gets a self-constructed graduate degree in music by studying voice with both George James Webb, another kind of first-class church organist type of person, and a composer, as well as with Reinhold Ludwig Hermann, who's a German musician, instrumentalist, but also vocal coach. He studies music theory with Samuel Prowse Warren, who again also a well-known New York organist choir master and composer, and a founding member of the American Guild of Organists, and also John Henry Cornell, who is known for kind of writing one of the was basically a very well-known music theorist, wrote one of the first books of music theory in the 1890s. AD is in the music teacher food chain at this point. He's both taking lessons from very prominent musicians, but he's also starting to give lessons to make some money to offset his expenses. And when that's something that he does the entire uh, his entire working life. So is as he does a vocal coach during the daytime. Eventually he has rooms in Carnegie Hall where he gives voice lessons. And at its peak, he was teaching 75 lessons a week. So very prolific. In fact, that's the one takeaway you'll have is that AD was quite a worker. Um, like you'll see, quite impressive. He also, now this is done for fun, but in 1876 he joins the Mendelssohn Glee Club, then 10 years old, and it was the first of the kind of non-German large men's courses in New York, and the kind of the first. I think it's basically considered America's oldest non-college glee club, and he becomes their star tenor. And all the reporting is that over the next 20 years, most of the tenor solos, at 75% in sub accounting, go to AD. So there he's known as a singer and a member, not the conductor. He also becomes tenor soloist. He moves from St. James Madison Avenue to St. Andrews Harlem. So again, he's sort of moved. He's still Episcopal Church singer and moving north, basically with the expansion of densely settled Manhattan at this point into the 120s. That church, which is still there, was newly built, and at the time that he arrives as their tenor, the following year in 1877 they reorganize their chorus and they give AD the job of conducting it, and that's his first position as a conductor of a chorus. And there he meets Uretta Cromwell Dayton, who's the daughter of the senior warden, and eventually becomes Mrs. A.D. Woodruff when he marries her in a few years later in 1883. So, with this buildup, he succeeds by 1878 in having a full-time career as a musician. He gets a job in 1878 now as the music director of he's not, well, he has keyboard skills. He could play the piano. He was never a professional organist, so there was an organist also at Church of the Incarnation, but he was the senior guy, and their desire was to have a top flight choir. So he, impressed by what he had done at St. Andrews Harlem, they hire him at the church in Murray Hill, still standing, on Madison Avenue in 36th Street, I believe, or 35th. And they hire him for a salary of $2,500, which is, I looked it up. It's now, that would be between $75,000 and $80,000 today. So basically a decent full-time job, and kind of comparable to what full-time musicians in this gig, in this kind of world, make today, although maybe they have to do more in New York, probably get housing on top of it. But the choir is very successful. He's there until 1895, and so that is very much a base of earnings that can support him and his then growing family. But when the rector dies in 1895, his successor wants to have a boys' choir, kind of a la St. Thomas Fifth Avenue, and AD quits, and he's not happy with this move. But he never takes a church job again. And you'll see that, interesting things about AD in the 1890s and 1900s is that he's really the only conductor that I'm aware of that I can see who is living solely on conducting income without having a big church or orchestra or kind of institutional job underlying it. That's kind of how successful he is, and also how busy he is. He also, while he becomes he maintains his soloist career in addition to doing the things at the Mendelssohn Club, which I don't think he's getting paid for, but he does become a paid oratorio soloist doing major works up and down the East Coast. And these are most typically being the tenor soloist in the Messiah and in Handel's Creation and Mendelssohn's Elijah and other big oratorio works. And he sings with the New York Oratorio Society. He sings with the Boston Handel and Haydn Society, and is very much known as one of the top tenor soloists. I want to take a pause um, before we go into kind of what happens with the rest of his career and look at what's going on, in particular with men's choral music. I think it's important to say that both that his experience was in mixed voice conducting, but ultimately he does a lot and is very well known for his conducting of male voice groups, and he also does female voice groups. Um, Equally, his career is across all three types. I want to focus a little bit on the men's side because it's a little unconventional, and it's the genre with which he's most closely associated. Um, the men's choral world in America, it was very much falling out of two major national traditions, that of England and that of Germany. On the English side, in the 18th century, you saw the emergence of catch clubs, which was basically catch clubs were basically in various towns and cities throughout England, informal men's groups to sing different secular songs. The name of the group is after a catch, which is a kind of a round-based, usually three-part men's song, usually funny in nature, droll. There's a lot of humor. I think there's a lot of drinking involved in these clubs. The Glee Club itself, as a term, comes from the Glee, which is another form of English part song. And the first club that used the term Glee Club was called the Glee Club in 1787 in London. This is the source. Their official song is Samuel Webb's Glorious Apollo, which is a Glee, 18th century Glee. And so all other Glee clubs owe their name to the fact that the Glee Club decided to call itself, and it was quite a successful enterprise. It reminds me of the word cocktail. The first cocktail was called the Cocktail, and of course the whole tradition took off, and now the original cocktail we call an old fashioned. That's where it gets its name. But anyway, the Glee Club is as a name is coming from that London group. Glees are kind of descended from English madrigals, secular in nature, mostly homophonics, a little bit of polyphony. And the use of the word is not so common anymore, but it was subsumed into the broader sense of part song in the 19th century. The Germans, at the same time, in the 18th century, built up, in early 19th century, a tradition of men singing groups throughout Germany, and these had different names: Männerchor, which means men's chorus; Liedertafel, which means song table; Liederkranz, which means song ring or wreath; and Männergesangverein, or men's choral union, men's choral group. The oldest one, I think, with this name is the Liedertafel in Berlin in 1809, but it was copied elsewhere. In America, the Germans groups are really the first to be established as choruses. We have the Gesangverein in Philadelphia in 1835. There was a Liederkranz in Baltimore in 1836. Gesangverein in Cincinnati, 1838. Liederkranz still exists in New York City, 1847. Teutonia Männerchor in Pittsburgh. Germania Männerchor in Chicago, and many, many, many others. Basically, almost every city where there was a concentration of German Americans, you would see groups like this, and in some cases, they're kind of female counterparts, and very big vocal tradition. The colleges began to pick up on both the example of English glee clubs and German groups, and being exposed to the music that was being composed for them. And in 1858, Harvard founded its Glee Club, followed in rapid succession by many colleges across the country. By 1875, there were 20 men's Glee clubs. The photo there is the original Yale Glee Club, so it was a smaller group. But I think you get from the nature of the photo that these were student-led groups, so typically didn't have conductors for quite a while. They were kind of outside the curriculum, extracurricular, we would say, and were fun. So this was very much, a lot of it was about entertainment of themselves, and then evolved into entertainment of others, and then evolved to, greater formality and wider audiences and greater professionalism. With people beginning to graduate out of these colleges into the cities in the basically in the 1860s, you see, and people who are not necessarily naturally going to go into a German language singing group, you see demand for, I'm calling them city clubs. It's not really a term, academic term, but basically men's chorus for adults. And forgive me not calling college kids adults, but and the first of these is founded in New York City as the Mendelssohn Glee Club. I think it's an interesting choice of name because they chose a German composer, but this was basically meant for everybody and as an alternative to the German language singing groups. They hired a German American conductor. I mean, one of the big differences between these men's groups and the college groups is that the members here were working professionals, so they had money. So part of they wanted to have fun, but they one of the early moves was that they hired professional musicians of quite high caliber who would to be their conductors. And here you have Mosenthal, again a German composer. He was actually a violinist in the New York Philharmonic, and prominent guy associated with the Mendelssohn Glee Club for almost 25 years. The Apollo Club is founded in Boston in 1871. They hire B.J. Lang, who was one of Boston's most well-regarded musicians, was also a big oratorio, symphony conductor, church organist, etc. The Orpheus Club in 1872, still existing, like the Apollo Club, still existing. They hire Michael Cross, who is the organist at the Roman Catholic Cathedral, very prominent musician overall. The Mendelssohn Club of Philadelphia, so kind of riffing on the Mendelssohn Club in New York, founded 2 years later. They hire William Wallace Gilchrist, who's a big Episcopal Church organist and conductor, and also a composer in Philadelphia. The Apollo Club of Brooklyn in 1877, they hired Dudley Buck, who is a Episcopal Church organist at Holy Trinity, Brooklyn, and associated them with many years. So this was the pattern. Each of these cities started having men's glee clubs and started also hiring, in this case you can see with pretty long tenures at the outset, first-class musicians. Mixed voice choirs, also part of A.D.'s world. This is what he was doing as his main job at this point. But they, to a great extent, are coming out of Protestant church, the Protestant church music world. So choirs for church, and churches were very much the engine of choral organization and repertoire development to a great extent in America. And A.D.'s career shows that. It's a prime example. But there were also spin-offs into community choirs. St. George Church in New York formed a separate choral society in 1818, so very early. And churches and their musicians would do outside concerts as kind of part of their music making in their communities. There were also large organizations whose primary purpose was to prepare choirs for orchestral performances, and being formed at around the same time. So Boston's Handel and Haydn Society is early 1815, but then you had the Oratorio Society of New York which puts on, at its outset in 1873, put on Handel Messiah for Christmas, and they still do that every year to this day. So they're very much the big engines on mixed voice performance. There are also women's choirs, and I point them out specifically also because of the interest of how very early on the women's colleges imitated their male counterparts in creating women's groups in college, and then these people were also then going into communities with kind of some experience in singing and wanting to continue. Early examples of this are the Vassar Choir in 1876, so pretty early in Vassar, after Vassar was formed as a college, and the Smith College Glee Club, formed in 1885. This photo is of the Smith. This is a combination of the Smith College Glee Club and the Smith College Mandolin Club, and I'm amused because the photograph is very much in the style of the men's group photographs at the same era, and they're using the word Glee Club as opposed to choir or choral society. It was also quite a conscious of wanting to double the example of the Amherst Glee Club on the road or wherever. So in the cities and towns in the 1880s, this movement begins to grow, and we'll see how it affected AD's career. But one thing I wanted to say right now, that the groups that he started to get involved in were very much elite institutions, and saw that and kind of were both clubs and choirs at the same time. So while they were auditioned, they were certainly auditioned, and members had to be accepted. So there was kind of a screening, just like you would have in a social club. Music also was very much member-led in these organizations, not the pure domain of a conductor like you might have in an orchestra setting, where that's part of what they're being hired to do. Not so in these choral clubs. The conductor is very influential, very important, and clearly these clubs did a very good job of managing long-term relationships with conductors, but to a certain extent they were hired hands. The members were professionals, usually college graduates, but certainly professionals. And in the female group, in the mixed groups, in the female groups, they were also professionals or their social counterparts. Concerts were generally formal and private, and here you see an example of the invitation to the University Glee Club in New York City's first private concert in January 1895, and there it is, very prominent. It's a private concert. These basically were performances that were for the family and invited friends of the members, or you could buy a subscription to the concert as an associate member, but would also have to go through an approval process. They had capped memberships, and they had waiting lists, just like a club might have. What you'll see is that then in the 1890s, the incredible growth of the country in terms of population and economy, but also transportation and housing infrastructure from the cities into the suburbs, meant that these institutions also spread from the cities into the suburbs starting in the 1880s. So back to our story. Arthur, now at Church of the Incarnation in 1880, receives an invitation from the Englewood Choral Club, a mixed voice club in Englewood, New Jersey. And he thinks about it and decides that, in his own words, that he should accept. He realizes that he's got the talent to do this. And in his own words, he said, "I could turn the trick," which I immediately decided to do. And so despite the distance involved, because he was living in New York City, he takes on engagement traveling to Englewood once a week to conduct the choral club. The following year, he's invited by the student group at Columbia, who started Glee Club that year in 1881, but they ask him to be their conductor. which he agrees to do. So this is also a relatively new thing. Some of the Glee clubs had faculty advisors, but here Columbia was asking an outside person because AD did not have any affiliation with the college or university, but to be their kind of conductor and guide. He takes that on. He forms a choral club in Harlem, so this is the neighborhood where his previous church was, a mixed voice choir also that year in 1881. He is asked to conduct the Glee Club, a men's Glee Club. By the way, the bold means man, the italics is female, and regular font is mixed voice. But the Produce Exchange, which was a very large enterprise, basically the kind of predecessor of the New York Commodities Exchange, big building that was just opened in the 1880s on Bowling Green, corner of Bowling Green and Broadway. But they had 3,000 members, and they had a Glee Club. And they started one in 1882. They asked AD to conduct that. He agreed. He starts in this, I believe I'm pretty sure this is a summer group, but in 1885 he starts a mixed voice group in Washington, the Washington Choral Club, Washington, Connecticut. And at this point, and then in 1886 he agrees to be conductor of the Summit Choral Society, then a mixed voice group. It evolves a bit. At this point, he's got 5 rehearsals a week, so he's doing a rehearsal every day, as well as at least 4 days a week, sometimes 5, and as well as his church choir. So he's and teaching during the day. So that's how he's built his career, and he continues to build it. The portfolio of his conducting gigs evolves. He rolls off Englewood Choral Club for reasons unknown, but takes up the Montclair Glee Club, a mixed voice group, in 1887. Then a group of some members of the Columbia Glee Club from the class of 1888, they graduate, but they decide that they want to keep going as an alumni Glee Club. So they form their own Columbia Alumni Glee Club in 1888 and ask AD to conduct it as well, which he agrees to do. That group itself then, 6 years later, in 1894, decides that it wants to grow. So it connects with other people who are graduates of other colleges, and they sort of disband the Columbia Alumni Glee Club and nestle their members into a larger University Glee Club of New York City. So that's my Glee Club. That opened shop in 1894, incorporates in 1894, does their first concert that you saw the ticket of in 1895, and AD is their conductor for the next 30 years. And then you can see the progression. He takes on the Elizabeth Glee Club in New Jersey, which is a mixed voice, and Elizabeth Music Club, which is a Glee Club, the Orange Musical Art Society, a women's group that he conducts for many, many years, for also like 30 years in Orange, New Jersey. He takes on the Lyric Club of New York, also a women's group in 1900 that he also conducts for a long time. He conducts a Glee Club, the Men's Chorus of the Oranges. He conducts the University Glee Club of Brooklyn for a few years, Women's Choral Society in New Jersey, Litchfield Singing Club, so again, probably a summer group in Connecticut. He does a gig for a few years for many years with the Hope Lodge, a Masonic group in New Jersey. The Englewood Musical Arts Society, a women's group, Summit Choral Society, who's the Recreation now as a men's group, as a women's group, and then also the Summit Glee Club, its men's counterpart. They've now reemerged, still exists as the Summit Chorale. He then becomes the conductor of the Orpheus Club of Philadelphia, so one of the historic Glee clubs and kind of the counterpart of the UGC in Philadelphia. He conducts them from 1912 until 1930. And then, lastly, he becomes very involved in the Mass Glee Club movement in 1924. After he kind of steps down as conductor of the University Glee Club, becomes pretty active in the organization around the Associated Glee Club, which is an annual national men's chorus reunion and concert and recording gig convention done every year in the 1920s and early 1930s. So very prolific and doing basically continually around 5 groups a year. He did manage to also have a family. He and Yoretta, in 1898, they move into an apartment at 126 West 11th Street. The building's still there. They have 5 children, only 2 of whom lived into adulthood. Their oldest child, Albert, died the summer before he was to start college at Harvard, unfortunately. He had a daughter, Irene, that died as a young girl. Um, their third child, Ellen, um, married John Lawton. All the descendants of Arthur are from, and Yoretta are from that marriage. Another son that died as a child, and then their youngest, Janie, who lived a long life but never married, and in fact uh, uh, kept house with AD after Yoretta passed away in 1922, and continued to live with him for the rest of his life. And then basically she spent her later years in Washington as a teacher, and then retiree in Washington, Connecticut, where she's also buried. The whole family are in Washington Cemetery with their ancestors. So Arthur Woodruff is basically speaking for the University Glee Club, and I certainly know that this is the case for the Orpheus Club of Philadelphia and the Mendelssohn Glee Club, but he's held in very high esteem, and his memories are the embers of his memories are kept alive. He was very much known as Dear Old Conductor, initials DOC. So while his address is AD, Doc also became part of what he was called. And he was eventually, the University Glee Club ended up creating a little song for him. It's no longer in our memory because we don't sing it to our current conductors. It was reserved for Arthur. But yeah, he had his own song. This is a studio portrait of him conducting from the 1920s. And you can see a little picture, a cartoon from one of the UGC dinner programs in the 1916, which is clearly a reference to visual reference to the Dear Old Conductor. The era in which he worked was changing. However, an amateur like him was, in a way, he was lucky, and it was unusual for him to have the job that the kind of career that he had, and the college glee clubs that were basically amateur-led for many years, that began to change in the same era where AD was conducting the Orpheus Club and the University Glee Club. Harvard in 1920 hires one of its alums, Archibald Davison, to be their Glee Club director. He was one of their first professors of full-time professors of music, and they basically decide to professionalize the conducting the group. Yale does the same thing, hires one of their young alums, Marshall Bartholomew, who was an assistant conductor of the UGC at the time that he got the Yale job, but they make that position also full-time. And both of those gentlemen turned their college glee clubs into very serious, sophisticated choral machines of national prominence, and are kind of the leaders in development of repertoire and performance style of the Glee Club movement overall. For the UGC, AD steps down in 1924 in favor of Marshall Bartholomew, who becomes the successor. Barty stays only for 3 more years until Yale makes his position full-time, and he decides he can't do the commute. And he's replaced by Channing Lefebvre, who's also a kind of a first-class Episcopal Church musician. He's the organist at Trinity Wall Street. And that's a position that he keeps for 41 years, even after he moves from New York and takes the job as the organist and choir master at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire. He commutes to New York every Thursday nights for UGC from New Hampshire, which is impressive. Similar at the Orpheus Club, when he retires later in 1830, he's replaced by a well-known local orchestra conductor and composer, Alberto Bobboni. But he was very much honored in his later years. Rutgers gives him an honorary degree of Doctor of Music, so he does become actually doc. It's their first honorary doctorate in music ever. University Glee Club makes him conductor emeritus when he retires from the UGC gig in the spring of 1924. When he fully retires from Orpheus Club and from his 50 years as head of the Englewood Choral Society, in May 1930, all these groups get together and throw him a Golden Jubilee concert at Carnegie Hall. The participants are all the groups that he was still conducting: the Orange Musical Society, England Musical Arts Society, University Glee Club, where he's conductor emeritus, and the Orpheus Club of Philadelphia, with Reinhard Wiernoff of the Met Opera, who's also a UGC member, Alfred O'Shea, the very famous Irish tenor of the time, and Met soprano Irene Williams. So a big blowout concert in his honor. President Hoover sends a congratulatory telegram. He dies in 1934 at age 81. On his 80th birthday, the previous summer, UGC members travel up to Washington for his birthday. And from one of our little newsletters at the time, the writer writes, "Things were progressing in a quiet and orderly fashion when upon the fastness of that old New England town boomed out, 'We meet again tonight, boys,' and then announced, 'AD, we are here.' And was the young feller taken aback? Tears filled his eyes and he mumbled, 'Can you imagine 40 darned old fools leaving their business to come up here and see me?'" So we conclude with Son of Washington in Washington soil after a very distinguished, unusual, and busy career. So he's definitely someone for Washingtonians to be proud of. And that concludes my remarks. I'd be happy to take any questions, Amy.
Right. Does anyone have any questions? If you do, please put them in the chat box. John, thank you so much. I learned so much about Dr. Woodruff. Would you like to just mention this last slide?
Oh, yeah, I forgot to say, yeah, another advertisement. So if you really want to if you like what you hear and you want to see AD's legacy in action, our next concert on May 17th in New York City at Jazz at Lincoln Center is with Chanticleer, which is the kind of most famous professional men's group in the country, and it would be very much worth your while. It'd be a great concert. So thanks for.
And we have a comment in the chat box, which from Carol, that says, "This was wonderful. Thank you so much."